myself and I ask you, my brothers and sisters, are we from the first group or second group? Are we the seekers of dunya or the seekers of akhirah? Ask this question. Ask yourself this question tonight.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, Wassalat wassalam Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi tayyibin tahirin, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Today we're going to be talking about the subject of depression and anxiety from an Islamic point of view. And before we discuss the issue, we need to talk about maybe what is the extent of the problem of mental illness, depression. Specifically, we're not referring to all forms of mental illness, specifically depression and anxiety in the United States. Currently, according to the ADAA, anxiety disorders are the most common mental illness in the United States. They currently affect about 40 million adults aged 18 or older. That's about 18% of the total population. So when we say anxiety or depression, what are we specifically talking about? It's not as if anytime someone feels sad or blue or anxious that's related to some type of a mental illness or specifically to what's called clinical anxiety depression. Life events can cause sadness. So it's normal, for example, if you lose a loved one, suddenly become unemployed, divorced, etc., that a person would feel sad. And suffering as a result of these types of events is considered normal. And for somebody who has faith, it's actually can be beneficial if it's understood correctly. The other time when it would be normal to feel sad or depressed is when we ourselves make a wrong decision or we make a bad decision. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given all human beings free will. Because we have free will, of course, sometimes we misuse this gift of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and we make poor decisions. Poor choices are also known as sin. So we're referring specifically to when someone commits a sin. We're not talking about all bad decisions. We're saying if you do something that's haram or if you do something you know is against what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants you to do, then it's normal that you would feel, of course, sad. In fact, you should feel that way. The cure in that case is simple and obvious. It's to repent and repair the consequences of one's actions. So again, from the perspective of Islam, if the depression or the anxiety is related to either a life event or a bad or wrong decision, that would be considered normal and that would not be considered having depression or anxiety from a clinical point of view. What's abnormal and what's normally referred to when we talk about depression or anxiety disorder is abnormal depression or anxiety that is regular and severe, and it's disconnected from any particular life event or decision. So this is in a case where a person feels depressed or feels anxious for a long period of time, and if you ask them, why are you feeling that way, they can't point to a specific event or a specific thing that happened or a specific thing that they did that made them feel that way. It's like a general feeling that is kind of clouds over everything in their life. The World Health Organization, they recently did a study about anxiety and depression worldwide. And one of the things that they found was that wealthy countries or wealthy societies, specifically referring to the United States and European countries and other developed countries like Japan, they actually have higher rates of clinical depression than people from lower income societies, which is surprising. Anecdotally, you would think that people who live in countries where the political and economic situations are less stable than here, you would think that because they're going through a lot more things in their life, you would actually think that they would have higher rates, but they're actually lower. It's difficult to explain this phenomenon based on the current scientific paradigm. So up to now, we've pretty much been describing what depression and anxiety is, how many people it's affected in the United States, and specifically referring to the United States. But more important than describing it, of course, we want to understand, number one, what the cause of depression and anxiety disorders are, and then what the potential or possible cures are. So we're going to be looking at it two different ways. We're going to be looking at it from a scientific point of view. When I say scientific, I mean Western empirical science that depends on material causes, material cures. And then we're going to be looking at it from a religious or from a Muslim perspective in regards to the causes and then the cures of it. So from a scientific point of view, it is actually one of the most difficult diseases for them to treat and also to identify the specific, biological, chemical causes of it. There's a lot of speculation within the scientific community regarding the cause of depression and anxiety. Some of the potential causes, again, just based on what I've read, are genetic, your biology, your age, your life circumstances, etc. There is evidence that physical and chemical functioning of the brain of a depressed person is different than a non-depressed person. So, of course, they can do PET scans and MRIs, and they can track the areas of activity for a person that's suffering from depression or anxiety, and then compare those to a person who's not suffering from those things. And, of course, they do notice that there are differences in the way that the brains function. Of course, what the problem is, they can't prove the direction of phenomenon. So, in other words, they don't know if when a person becomes depressed or anxious, that causes the brain to function differently, or vice versa, or if the brain of depressed people functions differently and that's what causes depression. So the direction of the cause is something that they're not able to determine from a scientific point of view. The numerous different possible causes, when you read the literature of depression and anxiety, indicate that science at this point has not been able to determine a specific cause for depression and anxiety from a empirical point of view. In other words, from a biological, neurochemical point of view. They do have medications that treat depression and anxiety famously. Anyone who's worked in an office or been in a school in the United States will run into numerous people that are on medication for depression and anxiety, but it's pretty hard to determine, whether the pills that they're taking are, obviously there's lots of famous ones, Prozac, Zoloft, those types of medications, whether whether what happens to you or the side effects of taking those medications is worse than the actual depression or anxiety itself. And the other thing is, pretty much you have to keep taking those medications for the rest of your life, or if you don't, then you'll become depressed again. So they don't really cure depression, they just simply mask the symptoms. And there are chemicals within the brain that are associated with depression and anxiety that if you turn those up or turn those down, that does have an effect on whether someone is depressed. But again, it doesn't really get to the root cause of the depression just because they don't really understand, again, from a scientific point of view, what really causes it. From a religious or from a spiritual point of view, there are, of course, other religions other than Islam that have, a pretty strong opinion on what the cause of depression and anxiety would be. One of the examples of that would be Buddhism. So in the case of Buddhism, they, for example, see the material world itself, root of all suffering. primary pillar of Buddhism, the main point of Buddhism, is to relieve suffering. So if you see our physical existence as the cause of suffering, then, of course, you would try to, as much as possible, minimize your interaction with the physical world. And it's only ridding yourself of the illusion of the physical world or the intoxication of the physical world, that we can ultimately end suffering and achieve, what they call peace or nirvana. Most Muslims would say this is an extreme position. It's not to say that there's not some degree of truth in what they're saying, but it's a very extreme type of position to take. There is, of course, in Islam, the dichotomy between the dunya and the akhirah, which we've talked about before, which is the dunya is representing this life and the akhirah is representing the next life. However, the distinction is not as simple and as straightforward as Buddhism presents it, or as some other religions. Even in Christianity, there's a ascetic tradition, which is basically monks who go off and live in the middle of the desert or in the middle of a forest, and have no money, have no job, don't have contact with people, and essentially try to rid themselves of any type of dependence on the physical world. In most religious traditions, there is what's called asceticism. Even within Islam, there's the Sufis, who basically share a very similar idea, trying to rid themselves of any kind of connection to the physical world, and they think that this will ultimately result in spiritual enlightenment, etc. This is too simplistic of an idea. Not that it doesn't have truth in it, but it's too simplistic, and following that path is not going to result in the goal. So Imam Jafar Sadiq alayhi salam says that the person that is constantly seeking after the physical material world, and that's their only concern, God will make them poor. They won't ultimately achieve their goal. And the person that shuns this world or this lower existence, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give them contentment and will make them essentially achieve their goals. What needs to be said regarding this hadith and other hadiths like this is that the term the dunya, or this world or this lower life, it doesn't mean to signify literally our physical reality. In fact, there's hadiths, for example, from Imam Ali Islam, where he praises this world and says that the world is useful, and that if you take the world for what it is, this physical existence for what it is, and you use it in the correct way, that you can get a lot of benefit from the world. So it doesn't mean, again, when we talk about the dunya, we're not talking about the physical or material world so much as the dunya represents a state of being wholly absorbed in the apparent physical realm, and to not give any consideration or not give any thought to the spiritual matters, the spiritual reality that also exists alongside this physical world, or the next life, or the akhirah. Again, from an Islamic point of view, the root cause of depression is not the world itself, is not the dunya itself, but it's being excessively attached to the dunya and also neglecting the hereafter. This physical world, by its very nature, is temporary. We live here for a relatively short period of time. It's unstable. Anyone who's tried to fulfill their desires or from this world, has been disappointed many, many times. And it should become obvious at some point to any kind of rational person that the nature of this world does not lend itself to satisfaction, to peace. It lends itself to temporary comfort and temporary fleeting pleasure, but it's not the type of comfort or pleasure that ultimately is going to satisfy the human being. And lots of times, by excessively seeking those temporary fleeting comforts, it causes a person to neglect or to not be mindful of what's going to give them ultimate peace and ultimate satisfaction, which is going to be the next world. So one of the best examples that we have in Islamic literature of this idea or of this principle is the example of Omar ibn Sa'd and Imam Hussein alayhi salam. So Omar ibn Sa'd was essentially the general who commanded the army that fought against Imam Hussein alayhi salam, and he was essentially willing to murder Imam Hussein for the sake of a promise that was given to him by Yazid or by Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad, who was the governor of Kufa at the time. And we have a very good video about that we'd like to end with.
One of the striking stories in the history of Islam, when Imam Hussein alayhi salam was murdered in Karbala, the chief military commander in Karbala in the field was Umar ibn Sa'd ibn Abi al-Waqqas. His father was a very noble man. Umar, his father, Sa'd ibn Abi al-Waqqas, was a very noble man in the history of Islam. Very decorated military commander with lots of achievements. Sa'd ibn Abi al-Waqqas. His son Umar was deviant. Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad said, Umar, when your mission is accomplished and you come back to me to Kufa, crushing Hussein, murdering him, I'm going to appoint you the governor of Ray. Ray, the ancient name of Tehran. On the night of Ashura, he had a private audience with Imam Hussein. Imam Hussein said, Umar, I want to talk to you. So they were sitting by themselves in the tent. Imam Hussein said to him, Umar, aren't you my relative? He said, yes. Do you know me very well? He said, of course. I know you. I know your mother, your father, your grandfather. I know everything about you. And I know your position with your grandfather, the Prophet. And I know how much the Prophet loved you and he adored you. And I heard all these things about you. Husaynun minni wa ana min Husayn, ahabba Allah man ahabba Husaynan. I know all these things. He said, then why do you want to murder me? He said, because if I don't murder you, someone else is going to murder you. Allahu Akbar. Imam Hussein said to him, but leave someone else to murder me. Why not? This was a pretext, of course. He said, if I don't accomplish this mission, I feel the persecution of Ibn Ziyad. He's going to destroy my house. Imam Hussein says, I will build a house for you. He said, he's going to capture me. Imam Hussein says, come to me, to my company, I'm going to protect you. Whatever he said, Imam Hussein says, I would take care of you. At the end, he said, no, I have to listen to the commands of my ruler, my boss, Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad. Umar ibn Sa'd, when he accomplished the mission and he murdered Imam Hussein, and he made his body to be cut into pieces, he went to Kufa to meet Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad. Ubaydullah did not even want to meet with him. He knocked at the door. They said, the governor is busy. He doesn't have time to meet with you. Imagine the disappointment and the disgrace. And then when he was able eventually to meet him, to meet his boss, the boss said to him, Umar, you don't know what I heard about you on the eve of Ashura? On the eve of Ashura, you were not very confident. You were not very strong in murdering Hussein. You had some hesitation, I knew. I had some spies spying on you. They came and they said to me, he did not go forcefully to fight Hussein. He was hesitant on that night, whether I should do this or not. Because of this, you are not going to get the leadership of the city of Ray in Iran. You are not going to get it.